So Savinelli, Scontris, and Pearl 2018, when trying to understand this adult endorsement behavior, decided to use the Rational Speech Act framework again to try to see what was going on, and particularly to figure out the influence of pragmatic factors like question under discussion in the world versus grammatical factors like scope access. So we're going to focus first on that explicit contrast effect, the fact that when you had a 1 out of 2 context, you had 27.5% endorsement, but when you added in that explicit contrast, didn't change anything else, now you're up to 92.5% endorsement from adults with this same utterance. 2 kitties didn't jump on the bed, right? So in kids, this seemed to be driven primarily by pragmatic factors, with the grammatical factors not doing much. What happened with adults? Well, let's look again. What we're trying to see is when you have the explicit contrast, which is manipulating the context and potentially in different ways, you're up here. And without that contrast, you're down here, right? So you want to see a shift from down here to up there. And what do we see? Well, the pragmatic factors of world knowledge and the QUD do seem to have more impact. They're shifting it more from down here to up there than that scope factor is, although it's really the world state one where you are thinking about if kitties are good jumpers or not. That really seems to have the biggest shift, but it's still not quite there. Can we get it all the way there where we need it to be, right? No single factor on its own is quite enough to get the observed shift. So world knowledge is closest, right? Okay, so can we actually get that shift? So it turns out that you can. When the 2 pragmatic factors are combined, the observed behavior can be generated so long as adults have no bias in favor of the inverse scope. Okay, so remember we want to be down here, and then we want to be up there. So how do we get down here? We get down here by thinking that kitties are terrible jumpers, by having a bias for a question under discussion that's not very helpful. Did none of the kitties jump on the bed, right? And so if kitties are poor jumping, and we don't know what the QUD is about, excuse me, that's a uniform one, so we don't actually know. We don't have any bias for a question under discussion. It's not very helpful. Then we can get low behavior, right, as long as it's a 50-50 shot at inverse versus surface, or we actually prefer the surface pretty strongly, right? We can get down to the same endorsement rate that we see in adults. Versus if we have a very supportive pragmatic context, we can get up to that high endorsement rate no problem, right? It doesn't really matter what the scope axis, the grammatical factor is. So it only really seems to matter for getting down as low as the adults did in that original 1 out of 2 context. So this suggests that the same pragmatic factors really are probably responsible for increasing children's endorsement rates. They really matter. They really can push you up to high endorsement, irrespective of the grammatical factor. And so this suggests that there's continuity in the developmental process. Children don't have to fundamentally change the way they're doing things in order to develop into adults when it comes to resolving this kind of ambiguity in context. However, that grammatical factor does matter in order to get such a low endorsement rate in this context. To get down there, you really have to have a bias against the inverse scope in order to explain adult behavior. So that's one set of findings. Let's look at the other one, right? So now we're once again back in our 1 of 2 context where we have a really low endorsement rate. But if you shift to having 4 kitties, where 2 of them succeed, now this is amazing. Now 100% endorsement. So how do we explain that? Importantly, there's no explicit contrast. There's no shift really of the context in any way, except the number of participants, 4 kitties versus 2 kitties, right? So there's no shift in the pragmatic values. So whatever pragmatic values were in effect for this basic one that got such a low endorsement rate are still in effect for this one. It's just now it's okay, right? So how do you do that? So before, the low endorsement rate was because we thought kitties were poor jumpers. We didn't really know what the question under discussion was about, but it's no problem, right? The same model can get high endorsement rate in that 2 of 4 context, shifting the number of participants from 2 to 4 kitties, as long as you're biased against the inverse scope. So that grammatical factor really is mattering here, right? So it means the importance of grammatical factors is there for adult language understanding, right? Like it's really there in adults. We really see it in kids, but it seems to be there in adults. So maybe if we test kids in more carefully controlled experiments, we'll be able to see the influence of grammatical factors on their language understanding too, but that is work to be done.